A black woman walked calmly through the bustling airport terminal, with a quiet confidence, her every step deliberate. As she moved toward the security checkpoint, the air around her felt thick, with the usual tension of travelers anxious to get through the routine process of airport security and head to their gates. But the woman was unfazed, her posture straight, her expression serene, as though she was used to the constant flow of people all around her. She reached the line where passengers were being processed one by one, the security officers, a mix of focused and indifferent, motioning travelers to place their items in the trays for scanning, the usual drill that everyone followed without complaint. She had done this many times before, but today something felt different. She didn't know what exactly it was. Perhaps it was the way the officer at the front of the line seemed to linger just a little too long as he scanned her face. Maybe it was the shift in his eyes that made her aware something wasn't quite right. He motioned for her to step forward, and she did without hesitation, her passport already in hand. She was used to these interactions, the momentary glance at her travel documents, the brief scan of her appearance, nothing extraordinary. But today it seemed the officer wasn't satisfied with the standard process. He stared at her passport, as though inspecting it too closely, as if something was wrong. When she noticed his gaze faltered just for a moment, she knew something had shifted. The officer's hand hesitated before taking the passport from her. He looked down at it, then back at her, as if searching for something beyond the words printed on the page. His expression was unreadable, but there was an edge to it, something that made her stomach tighten. She held his gaze for a moment before lowering her eyes to the tray in front of her. She wasn't sure what it was, but something told her this wasn't going to be a simple routine check. He raised his voice slightly as he motioned for her to step aside. A sharpness in his tone caught her off guard, but she complied without protest. She had been through enough airport security checks to know when something was off. It was a game of patience and understanding, or sometimes just being quiet and letting it unfold. The officer waved for her to wait in a nearby area, and she did, her eyes flicking to the other travelers, still moving through the line, each of them unaware of the sudden tension in the air. Her mind raced for a moment. Was this a mistake, a simple misunderstanding, or was there something else at play? She didn't know, but she was used to these moments of uncertainty. She had learned long ago how to keep her composure, even when things didn't feel right. The officer returned shortly with a colleague, both of them now standing before her eyes, scanning the documents as if trying to find something hidden. The woman didn't speak. She merely waited, watching them both as they flipped through the pages of her passport. The small details they focused on didn't escape her notice. She saw the slight shift in their posture, the barely perceptible exchange between them that suggested something had gone wrong. But still she said nothing. She simply stood tall and waited, hoping that whatever this was would be resolved quickly. She felt the eyes of the people around her, but she didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She wasn't afraid. They were not the ones who could determine the outcome of this moment. The officers exchanged another look before one of them turned sharply to her, his voice low but firm, as he asked her to follow him. She felt a flicker of concern now, but it didn't show on her face. Instead, she nodded and walked behind him, wondering just how much longer this would go on. The officer led her toward a small side area near the security desk, his footsteps echoing on the hard-tiled floor. The soft hum of the airport seemed distant as she followed him, each step purposeful yet unsure, her mind racing as she tried to process what was happening. The officer didn't say a word as he motioned for her to stand by a wall near a set of offices. His eyes darted between her and the others in the area. She stood still, watching him carefully, but saying nothing. Her calm demeanor remained intact despite the unease that was beginning to stir within her. There was something in the air now, something unspoken but heavy, hanging between them, as if the situation was about to shift into something darker. She noticed the other officers glancing at her with a strange mix of suspicion and curiosity, but none of them made eye contact with her. Instead, they continued their work as if pretending not to notice her presence. Her fingers subtly gripped the edges of her passport, but she kept it close to her side, not wanting to draw any more attention to herself. She had learned over the years how to stay composed, how to move through the world with grace, even when others didn't seem to expect it. The officer returned a few moments later with a colleague this time. The second officer was taller and broader, his movements deliberate, but with an edge of irritation in his eyes. The first officer spoke quietly with him, and then both of them turned to face her. She could sense the tension between the two officers, the uncertainty, as if they weren't sure how to proceed. But before either of them could speak, the first officer reached for her passport. Once again she watched him carefully, her pulse steady, but her instincts telling her this was no ordinary situation. The officer scanned the document again, flipping through the pages with greater scrutiny, now his eyes narrowing at certain stamps and markings, as if he was looking for something hidden beneath the surface. His fingers traced the edges of the passport, like he was examining a piece of evidence that didn't belong to her. She felt a flicker of irritation, but kept it hid in her mind, focused on the growing feeling that this wasn't about the passport itself, it was about her. But why? She had no answers, yet only the certainty that whatever was happening wasn't right. The officer's hand hesitated as he reached the final page of the passport. His gaze flicked upward to meet hers for the briefest of moments, then quickly back down to the document in his hand. She knew this look. It was the look of someone who had made a decision but didn't want to acknowledge it just yet. His voice cut through the air, with a sharpness that startled her as he spoke, demanding an explanation for a detail she hadn't expected to come up. He asked her about a particular stamp, the official mark of her diplomatic status, the one thing that could not be mistaken, the one thing that marked her as someone of immense importance, someone who was above the usual scrutiny of airport security. He asked it coldly, as if it meant nothing to him, as if he didn't realize the significance of what he was questioning. But in that instant she understood. She understood everything. The moment had shifted from a routine check to something much more personal, something much more dangerous. The officer's expression faltered for a split second as he processed what he had just questioned, his face betraying the realization that this wasn't just any traveler. This was someone important, someone whose identity he had just violated. Without a second thought, he glanced at his colleague, as if waiting for confirmation. But the second officer said nothing, his eyes flickering nervously between the two of them, as if unsure what to do next. The woman stood silently watching them, both, the weight of the moment pressing in on her chest. She could feel the room close in around her, as the realization set in that what had started as a simple mistake had now escalated to something much larger. The room seemed to narrow around them, the quiet hum of the airport now distant. As the two officers stood frozen for a brief moment, the second officer cleared his throat, as if trying to break the silence. But neither spoke. At first the woman remained still, her face composed, but her mind racing. She had seen this before, the moment when something simple turned into something more, and in that silence she realized the officer hadn't fully processed what he had done. Yet the weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. The officer finally spoke, his voice no longer as commanding but edged with uncertainty. As he tried to explain himself, she could see the shift in his demeanor. The confidence he had walked in with now replaced by something almost apologetic. The woman didn't respond at first, her eyes locked on his face, waiting for him to finish whatever he thought he needed to say. But nothing could ease the sting of the violation she had just experienced. She could feel the eyes of the other officers on her, as if they too were waiting for something to break, some sign that she was going to react. But she remained calm, her back straight, her breath slow and steady. The officer faltered again, his words seeming to lose strength as he spoke, asking if there had been a mistake with the passport, asking her to clarify the details of her identity. He was fumbling, trying to make sense of something that had already gone wrong. But in his attempt to fix it, he only dug himself deeper. He didn't know who she was. He hadn't realized yet what he had just uncovered, and that made the situation even more dangerous. She could feel the presence of the second officer shift again, his discomfort now more obvious as he avoided making eye contact with her, his hands clenched at his sides, the tension between them thickening with each passing second. The woman finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. As she addressed the officer's questions, she could hear the sharpness of her words. As they left her lips, she had no patience for explanations, no time to waste on an apology that wasn't yet given. She explained her status, her role as a UN ambassador, and the diplomatic immunity that came with it. The words rang out in the small room, a sudden wave of realization washing over the officers as they processed the weight of what they had done to someone of her stature. The officer's face drained of color, and his voice cracked as he apologized. But she didn't respond, her gaze cold. As she watched him struggle to find the right words, he asked if there was a way to fix the passport, but the question felt hollow, as though he could never truly undo what had been done. There was no simple repair to the damage that had already been caused, and she knew it. She had spent years navigating the challenges that came with her position, but she had never once expected to be treated this way, especially not by those meant to protect her rights, her identity, her safety. She didn't want his apology. She didn't need it. The damage had been done. And now it was a matter of principle. The officer seemed to collapse inward, his earlier composure gone, completely replaced by a frantic attempt to salvage something from the situation. But it was clear that nothing could fix the hurt he had caused, and the consequences were going to ripple far beyond this one moment. The woman didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, watching the unfolding mess. Before her eyes, the officers exchanged another uncomfortable look, and then one of them stepped away, reaching for a phone, as if to call for assistance. But the woman wasn't fooled. She knew it wasn't help they were calling for. It was a way to contain the situation before it became something much bigger, something they weren't prepared for. The realization had set in too late. Whispers began to ripple through the airport. As the scene unfolded, the tension was palpable and grew heavier with every passing second. Passengers now took notice. Some slowed their steps, others tried to steal glances at what was happening, but most avoided making direct eye contact, the atmosphere thick with curiosity and unease. As the woman stood unmoving at the center of it all, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos slowly building around her. The officer who had torn her passport seemed to have lost all sense of control. His earlier confidence had evaporated entirely. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he fumbled with his phone, as if he was waiting for someone to come and fix this. But no one could fix it now. The situation had already spiraled out of his control. As the seconds ticked, he glanced up at her once more, and for the first time she saw the raw regret in his eyes. But she did not allow herself to soften her gaze. It was too late for that, too late to undo the damage that had been done to her passport, to the violation of her rights, to the degrading assumption that she was anyone other than who she said she was. The other officer stood off to the side, looking nervously between his colleague and the woman. His fingers were twitching, as though he was unsure how to handle the situation, or if he even had the authority to do so. He shifted from foot to foot, his eyes not meeting hers, but instead scanning the room as if waiting for a signal of some kind. His discomfort was obvious, and it only made the scene feel more surreal. The woman kept her gaze steady, locked onto the officer who had caused this mess. He was still holding the phone, and he had started to speak into it, his voice low and hurried, as though he were explaining the situation to someone of authority. But the words didn't matter to her. The apology didn't matter either. What mattered now was what would happen next, what steps would be taken to make things right. But deep down she knew that nothing could truly make this right, not anymore. The damage had already been done. As the officers waited for assistance, one of the airport's senior security officers arrived, his uniform crisp, his expression serious. He took one look at the situation, and his eyes quickly moved from the woman to the officers standing in front of her. He was sharp-eyed and immediately sensed the gravity of the mistake that had been made. The woman could feel his gaze on her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stood straighter, her composure unbroken in the face of this unnecessary conflict. The senior officer spoke to the two officers in hushed tones, his voice sharp and firm. He clearly didn't need any explanation. He could see it all now. The mistake was too glaring to ignore, but still he spoke in low murmurs, trying to contain the situation as much as possible. The second officer looked down at his feet, trying not to meet anyone's eyes. The first officer was still on the phone, but he was growing more frantic with each word that came from the other end. The woman could hear the distant voices from the call, but it was as if they didn't matter anymore. Her thoughts were already miles ahead of this moment, her mind racing through the possibilities of what might happen next. But what truly struck her was how familiar this scene was, how often she had witnessed it from the other side, how often she had watched as people like her were forced to defend their very existence, to prove that they belonged in spaces where they should have never been questioned in the first place. As the senior officer turned back to face her, his expression softened ever so slightly, but it was clear that the damage had already been done, and there was no turning back from this moment. No amount of apology or regret would undo the hurt she felt in her chest, the feeling of being seen as something less than human, something to be doubted, something to be questioned, simply because of her race, her status, her identity. The officer's voice broke through her thoughts again. He was offering an apology of sorts, but it was empty and hollow, no real understanding in his words, just the desperate need to make the moment disappear. But it wouldn't disappear, not for her, not for anyone who had witnessed it, and definitely not for him. The senior officer seemed to sense this too as he motioned for the woman to follow him, his voice steady now as he began to address her with the respect she deserved. But she didn't move immediately. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her comply without a second thought. She would not be hurried, not now, not ever again. The senior officer stepped forward with an air of authority, but there was something in his gaze that made her hesitate. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an acknowledgement of the hurt. She felt it was something more tactical, a way to move the situation along, as if this could be resolved by simply removing her from the immediate chaos and placing her somewhere out of view. She could see the flicker of calculation in his eyes as he gestured for her to follow him, but she remained still, her gaze locked on him, her body unmoving, the space between them growing. As the seconds passed, she wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Perhaps she was waiting for a sign that something had truly shifted, that they recognized the full gravity of the situation. But she knew deep down that this wasn't just about the passport. It wasn't even about the violation. It was about something deeper, about how people like her were constantly forced to prove their worth, their identity, and their place in a world that saw them as something less than they were. The senior officer hesitated when he saw that she wasn't moving, and for a moment there was a shift in the air. He lowered his arm slightly as if unsure of how to proceed. He didn't seem to know what to do with her, not like he thought he would, and it irritated her even more than the initial mistake. She was used to being underestimated, to being dismissed, to being reduced to something smaller than she was. But she wouldn't let that happen now, not again. The officer looked back at the other two standing by her, and they were watching her now too, as if waiting for a signal or a hint of what would come next. But the woman didn't give them that. She didn't give them anything except the weight of her silence. She could see the confusion beginning to mount in their eyes, and it made her feel something inside her stir. It wasn't anger, not yet at least, but it was a kind of quiet frustration, the frustration of someone who had been through this too many times, the frustration of someone who knew the system too well to expect real change, but still held on to the belief that things could be different. She finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying the weight of years of unspoken pain. She told them who she was again, as if they hadn't already heard it, as if they didn't already know. But there was something in the air now that made the words feel more important than before. She reminded them that she was a UN ambassador, that her status meant something, that the treatment she had just endured was unacceptable. But even as the words left her mouth, she could see that none of them truly understood the full extent of what she was saying. They didn't understand because they didn't have to. They didn't live in the world she lived in. They didn't experience the daily weight of being questioned simply for existing. She could see the senior officer's jaw tighten, as if he was trying to mask his discomfort. But it was too late. The moment had already happened. The damage had been done, and no amount of words would change the truth. She was still standing there, still waiting for the recognition she deserved. The second officer finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough to break the silence. He apologized and said that they would handle it, that they would make it right. But she didn't believe him. She didn't believe any of them, because making it right meant more than just fixing the passport. It meant acknowledging the deeper issues at play. It meant seeing her not as an inconvenience, not as someone to be doubted, but as a human being with dignity and respect. But they didn't see that, not yet, and she knew it wasn't going to change with a few words or a quick fix. So she stood there silently, waiting for them to take the next step, but not allowing herself to bend or give in to the pressure of their discomfort. They could apologize all they wanted, but it wouldn't change the fact that the moment would linger with her long after she left this airport, long after they had moved on with their lives. She didn't need their apology to feel validated. She needed them to understand the weight of their actions, the harm they had caused, and she wasn't going to let them forget it. The silence in the room stretched out like a thick fog that none of them seemed to know how to navigate. The officers were still waiting for her to respond, but she wasn't ready to offer them anything, not yet. They had shown their true colors, and she wasn't in a hurry to pretend that their apologies meant anything at all. She could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on her. But she didn't flinch, not even when the senior officer cleared his throat, as if trying to bring the conversation to some kind of conclusion. She was tired of hearing them speak, tired of the empty words that meant nothing in the face of what had happened, tired of the politeness that would eventually wear off as they moved on to the next task on their list, with no real accountability. She knew this game too well. She had seen it in every interaction, every encounter, where she was seen as less, where her identity was questioned. And she had learned long ago that you couldn't wait for others to fix what was broken, you had to demand it. She stood firm, watching them with steady eyes as they tried to decide who would speak next. The second officer had taken a small step back, his discomfort now visible in the way he shifted his weight between his feet. His hands were still clenched, and he couldn't seem to meet her gaze. But the senior officer was the one who finally spoke again, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. But there was no real apology in his words, just a need to move forward, as if rushing to repair a crack in the surface without understanding the damage beneath. He offered her a seat in one of the nearby chairs, a space for her to wait, while they made the necessary calls to correct the situation. But she didn't move, not even an inch. She didn't want to be placated or moved around like a pawn in their little game of damage control. The idea of sitting down in that chair felt like an insult, like they were asking her to wait for something that would never come. She wasn't interested in their fixes, in their procedures that would only smooth things over for the moment and then leave her with the same empty feeling she had when she first arrived here, when her passport had been torn and her identity questioned. She could see the senior officer's impatience growing, but she didn't care. It didn't matter how uncomfortable they were with the silence, because it wasn't about them. It was about what had been taken from her, what they had tried to strip away in an instant when they had torn her passport and doubted who she was, when they had treated her like an outsider in a place she was supposed to be welcome. She finally spoke, her voice low but clear. She told them that she wasn't going to sit down, that she wasn't going to wait for them to fix something that was beyond fixing, that they had to understand what they had done to her, and to the countless others who had faced the same kind of treatment, who had been questioned and dismissed simply because of the way they looked or the assumptions others made about their lives. She told them she didn't need their charity, she didn't need their quick fixes. She needed them to understand that the damage they had caused went beyond the passport, beyond the inconvenience of a security check, and that it wasn't something they could resolve with a few phone calls or polite words. She could see the senior officer's face tighten, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at the second officer for confirmation, but the second officer didn't say anything, his gaze still averted to the floor, as if he couldn't handle the weight of what had been said. But the woman wasn't finished. She wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug. She told them both that the issue was never about the passport. The issue was about the assumption that she didn't belong, that she wasn't important enough to be treated with respect, that her status could be disregarded without a second thought, and that this kind of treatment wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern that people like her faced every day. She didn't raise her voice, but the power in her words was undeniable. She could feel the tension in the room shift as they absorbed what she was saying. But she didn't expect them to understand fully, not yet, not until they had experienced it for themselves. She could see the senior officer's face falter, but it wasn't an apology, it wasn't the recognition she was hoping for. It was simply the look of someone who realized that they had just made a mistake they couldn't take back, not ever again. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker with every word she spoke, as the weight of her statements began to settle on the officers who were still trying to find a way out of the situation without truly confronting what had happened. She could see it in their faces, the way they fidgeted with their uniforms, the way their eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something to take them away from the reality that they had just caused harm, and now they were scrambling to cover it up. But the woman wasn't going to let them. She wasn't going to let them move past this moment, as if it were a simple misunderstanding. She wasn't going to let them forget what they had done. She wasn't going to let them erase it with empty gestures or promises of quick fixes. The senior officer finally cleared his throat again, his voice low and uncertain this time as he spoke to her, asking her what she wanted them to do to make things right. But the question didn't sit right with her. It wasn't his place to ask what she wanted them to do. It wasn't her job to tell them how to fix what was broken. The responsibility lay with him and his colleagues to recognize the harm they had caused and to take the necessary steps to correct it without her having to spell it out for them. She didn't respond immediately. Her silence was deliberate, her way of reminding them that the ball was in their court, not hers. But the senior officer was persistent. He asked again, his voice edged with frustration, as if he were running out of patience with her silence and with the growing tension in the room. But she still didn't answer. She didn't have to. The message had already been made clear. Her identity, her worth, her status as a UN ambassador was not negotiable. It was not up for debate. She wasn't just anyone to be questioned at will and dismissed on a whim. The room grew quieter with each passing second, the tension hanging in the air, thick like a storm about to break. She could feel the officers' unease radiating off of them, but she didn't let it sway her. She wasn't afraid of their discomfort. She wasn't afraid of their frustration. What she was afraid of was the reality that so many others had experienced this same treatment and walked away without a voice, that their dignity had been stripped away in the same way her passport had been torn apart. The thought was enough to fuel her resolve. She could feel the eyes of the other airport staff on her now. They were all watching, not just the officers, but the other workers who had begun to gather near the edges of the room, unsure of whether to intervene or to stay out of it. But she didn't care about their eyes either. She wasn't going to let them forget what had happened. She wasn't going to let them pretend it was just a mistake or an isolated incident, because it wasn't. She had lived through too many of these moments to believe that it was just a fluke, too many of these small betrayals to let them slip through the cracks. She could see the senior officer's hands tremble as he reached for his phone again, likely to make another call. But she wasn't interested in their calls anymore. She wasn't interested in their attempts to fix things. She knew that no phone call could undo the damage of this moment, and no phone call could restore the respect she deserved. She wasn't waiting for their solution anymore. She wasn't waiting for them to fix it. She was the one who had to stand up and demand the recognition she had earned, the respect that had been stripped away from her. In the blink of an eye, the second officer spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. This time he offered an apology, but it was so weak it barely registered to her. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. She knew what they needed to do, but she wasn't going to hand it to them on a silver platter. They needed to understand the full weight of their actions, and that understanding couldn't come from a single apology or a quick fix. It had to come from a deeper recognition that what had happened to her wasn't just about a passport or a mistake. It was about a pattern of treatment that had gone on far too long, and it was time for it to end. She turned her eyes back to the senior officer, her gaze steady and unflinching, as she waited for him to understand that there was nothing he could do to make this right with words alone. The senior officer seemed to be at a loss for what to do next. His earlier calm had dissolved into confusion as he realized that his usual methods of diffusing the situation weren't working. Not this time, not with her. He had seen this type of incident before. The minor mistakes, the quick fixes, the apologies that smoothed everything over. But this woman wasn't allowing that to happen. Not here, not now. She had made it clear that this wasn't just about a torn passport. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or a small glitch that could be easily erased. This was about something far deeper, something ingrained in the system that had allowed this kind of treatment to continue unchecked. He could see the frustration in her eyes, the quiet power of someone who knew that she was right and that they had failed to meet the basic standard of respect. He had seen her as just another person passing through security at first, but now he saw her differently, not just as a woman, not just as a diplomat, but as someone who had been forced to endure too much for too long without the recognition or the respect she deserved. The room remained thick with silence. The other officers had stopped talking, their eyes turned toward the senior officer, waiting for him to take charge. But he wasn't sure what to do anymore, and that uncertainty only seemed to add to the tension. The woman had made her point clear. She wasn't going to be moved by their apologies. She wasn't going to let them treat this like just another incident that could be swept under the rug. She stood firm, her body unmoving, her eyes focused on the officer, who now seemed to understand that the situation had spiraled beyond what he could control. He cleared his throat again and spoke more carefully, this time his voice tentative, as he asked if there was anything they could do to resolve the issue. But the woman didn't respond, not immediately. She wasn't interested in their solutions. Not anymore. She had already told them that this wasn't about a quick fix. It was about something much bigger than the passport or the way they had treated her. It was about how people like her were too often seen as less than human, how the systems in place reinforced that view, and how the effects of that prejudice trickled down into every interaction. No matter how small, she wanted them to understand that this was not an isolated incident. It was a part of a pattern she had lived with for as long as she could remember, and as long as people like her continued to be treated this way, it would never change. No matter how many apologies or promises were made, she was tired of fighting against a system that never seemed to change, tired of explaining her worth, tired of reminding people that she belonged. She shouldn't have to. She didn't want to have to keep proving herself. It was their job to see her for who she was and to treat her accordingly. She wanted them to understand that the damage they had caused couldn't be fixed with a simple apology. It couldn't be fixed with promises of better behavior or more careful actions in the future. It needed to be addressed head on. It needed to be seen for what it was, not just a mistake, but a symptom of a larger problem. The officer finally stepped forward, his voice more measured this time, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. He seemed to understand now that the woman was right, but he still didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to undo the hurt he had caused, how to make her believe that they would do better. He spoke again, his words more deliberate, as he asked if there was any way to make amends. But she wasn't interested in his offer of amends. She wasn't interested in words anymore. She was interested in action. She was interested in seeing real change, and she knew that it wouldn't come from him, not in the way she needed it. He turned to the second officer, and then to the others in the room, as if to gather support, or perhaps to find a solution. But the woman wasn't watching them anymore. She had already made up her mind that this moment would not be forgotten, that she would take this story with her wherever she went, and she would continue to speak out for those who couldn't. She wasn't going to allow them to erase what had happened to her. She wasn't going to let them walk away from this and pretend that everything was fine, because it wasn't. Everything wasn't fine. And she would make sure that the world knew, that she would make sure that people saw what had happened here and understood that it was part of a much larger story that had yet to be fully told.